Hello, I'm Paul Pirello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. Well, what's the first thing that comes into your mind when I say Eastern State Penitentiary? Yeah, you're thinking terror behind the walls, you're thinking Halloween. Well, needless to say, that's just one small snippet of what Eastern State Penitentiary is all about. This prison that has been turned into a tourist destination in Philadelphia has really transformed itself into a year-round tourist destination. Eastern State was once the most famous and expensive prison in the world. Known for its grand architecture and strict discipline, Eastern State was the world's first true penitentiary, a prison designed to inspire penitence or true regret in the hearts of convicts. Well, here to discuss many of those offerings, besides Terror Behind the Walls, is Annie Anderson, Research and Public Programming Specialist for Eastern State. And Annie, I want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you.
I think you would agree that when you hear the words Eastern State Penitentiary, it has become such a part of our Halloween celebration, which has gone from when I was a kid, one night out of the year, to a whole month now. But when you think of Eastern State, the first thing that comes to mind is Terror Behind the Walls. But now, Eastern State really has become a year-round tourist destination.
That's right, yeah. Eastern State Penitentiary is open year-round, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every single day of the year, and it's really become a true tourist destination for its historic tours as well as our haunted house.
Yeah. Let's discuss where Eastern State is located, because people may not know the exact specific part of the city that the prison is located.
Sure. It's located in Fairmount, right on Fairmount Avenue, 2027 Fairmount. It's accessible by public transit, and it's right near the Parkway District, so it's within walking distance of the Barnes Foundation and the Art Museum, and it's in a lovely neighborhood, lots of restaurants and coffee shops and things to do.
Yeah, and there's no mistaking Eastern State Penitentiary when you stumble upon it. It's hard not to know what you're standing in front of because of the huge walls that surround what was, as I mentioned, the world's most expensive prison at one time.
Right. The facade is unmistakable. If you've ever driven by it or walked by it, you'll know it. It's a big castle-like facade with 30-foot high stone walls, and it's very imposing, and it was designed intentionally so that prisoners being taken into the building would look up at this Gothic-style architecture, and it would inspire fear in their hearts, and that it was just a very imposing structure, and it still is very imposing in the neighborhood, even though now it's surrounded by homes and restaurants. When it was built, it was in the countryside. It was actually built on a cherry orchard, and it was way out, about a mile outside of the city center, surrounded by farms, and of course, by the early 1900s, it was surrounded by city and lots of a vibrant neighborhood full of people.
Sure. Now, when they decided to turn the then closed prison into a tourist destination, it almost seemed logical to open it as a haunted house because of the sort of history that went with Eastern State. I guess I'm sort of intrigued how you take that structure there on Fairmount Avenue and utilize that history into making it a tourist destination, because some people may say, well, I'm really not interested in touring old prisons, just like I'm not necessarily interested in touring old cemeteries. But you've done a wonderful job in making this a popular tourist destination now year-round in Philadelphia.
Yeah, we have. People are very interested in the architecture. It's a very photogenic place. We have a lot of photographers coming to visit. And we have a lot of really interesting programming going on year-round. We're open 362 days a year, pretty much, year-round, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So people are interested in the darker aspects of the prison's history. It has a kind of dark tourism pull for people, but it also tells a kind of remarkable story about crime and punishment and architecture and different philosophies about how to punish or separate individuals who broke the law in some way.
What portion of the actual footprint of the prison is open for tours? I mean, I suspect that if you're going to take a tour, you're not seeing everything, but how much of the prison is really open for tourism?
Sure. We have a number of cell blocks open to the public, and the main audio tour route, which is what a lot of our visitors do, takes you through a number of cell blocks and ends you on the prison's baseball diamond, and then you're free to explore the other cell blocks. So I would say about half of the cell blocks are currently open to the public, and a number of cell blocks are in too ruinous of a condition. They're not safe for the public to access them, so those are closed. And then a number of other cell blocks have been used for terror behind the walls, so are not open to our daytime historic visitors, but are open to our terror behind the walls visitors.
So if a person is taking a tour of the prison, let's say on a nice spring day or a warm summer day, and they're seeing some of these cell blocks, are they seeing the cell blocks like they would have been when the prison was operational, or have they been cleaned up or maintained for, I guess, the integrity of the tour, that no one gets hurt or injured? I mean, so what exactly are we seeing on these tours?
Right, so if you came to Eastern State, you would see the prison in a ruinous condition. It's a stabilized ruin, and we've stabilized all parts of the building that are open to the public. And we don't do a lot of restoration projects. We're more interested in saving the original footprint and the original architecture and maintaining it as a ruin. So we do have some recreated cells of what it would look like when prisoners were there, but a lot of the cells are, have crumbling paint and overturned stools and some old rusty iron beds. And that kind of adds to the kind of stabilized ruin flavor of the historic site. We have a wide open prison baseball diamond. We have the greenhouse that's been restored. And so we have kind of ongoing restoration projects throughout the building. But you do get a sense of how the building deteriorated from when it closed in 1970 and when it opened as a historic site and museum in the early 1990s. There was a period of abandonment. So the historic site kind of captures that abandonment feel.
Is the site placed on either the local city historic register or a national historic register?
Yes, it's a National Historic Landmark. There's a state marker out front, a historic marker indicating that it's at a special status with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and it is a city landmark as well. So it's attained all sorts of status as a very important architectural treasure, as well as an important cultural artifact to display how we talk about, how we deal with crime throughout history, and how we punish and house individuals who have broken the law.
Yeah. One of the more famous inmates at Eastern State was a gentleman by the name of Al Capone, and you have recreated his cell there at Eastern State?
That's right, yes. So we have recreated his cell with what we think it looked like. So there's a beautiful rug on the floor, and there's a cabinet radio and a painting on the wall. And we think that he received some privileges that other inmates did not receive. There is some evidence that other inmates could buy paintings or rugs if they had enough money in their inmate account. But we do think he lived on a especially privileged part of the prison called Park Avenue or Ritz Row, and that he was an exceptional prisoner, and he was famous at the time that he was imprisoned at Eastern State. But his life in some ways was exceptional at Eastern State, and in some ways mirrored what other inmates were experiencing at that time. But yes, that's a popular visitor destination when they come to Eastern State, is to go see his cell.
Yeah, so when you go to see his cell, we saw a picture up on the screen there. I mean, are you able to go into the cell, or are you just looking at it from outside?
Right, so you're looking at it from outside. You can't actually go into it, but you can peek your head in and see what we think it might have looked like based on newspaper accounts of what it looked like.
So I'm sort of intrigued because I guess when you have a notorious inmate like Al Capone there, that there were no pictures taken to sort of capture the moment that they had this inmate there at Eastern State. So you're saying that much of how that cell's been recreated is because of newspaper articles, but I would think that someone somewhere in some archive would have a picture of what his cell looked like.
Well, we haven't found a photograph yet, but I'm a historian, and I'm always hopeful that in some archive, in some dusty old filing cabinet, we will find a photograph. And that's a great part of the fun of my job, is going through those archives and seeing what's out there. And there's still so much to know about Eastern State's history and so many stories to tell. We're still constantly unearthing new information and new newspaper articles about the individuals who served time at Eastern State. So that's an exciting part of the job.
Yeah, how long was he at Eastern State?
He was at Eastern State about 7 months,
okay.
From May of 1929 until March of 1930, or I should say August of 1929. He was incarcerated at Holmesburg Prison in the Northeast in Philadelphia for a few months before he was transferred to Eastern State.
And so he was afforded certain privileges that maybe other inmates or prisoners were not afforded?
Yes, he did receive some visits in the front administration building, and other inmates would have been receiving visitors in the visitation room with all the other inmates. And there was a fairly well-known bootlegger named Max Boo Boo Hoff who came to visit him at Eastern State. So he was definitely afforded some privileges that other inmates didn't. I mean, a lot of inmates had male privileges and visiting privileges, but he was living in a very nice section of the prison and was seeing visitors in the front administration building. And the press came out when he was to be released from Eastern State, and he definitely attracted a lot of media attention, although no photograph of his cell.
How about that? It would seem to be that given the mission of what Eastern State was all about having these inmates repent for their crimes, that what Al Capone was, the lifestyle that he was living there really didn't fall into that overall mission of repenting for one's wrongdoings.
Right, yeah. Well, Eastern State in the 20th century is a little bit different than Eastern State in the 19th century. When it was founded in the 19th century and it opened in 1829, it was founded on this Quaker philosophy that everyone had an inner light, and if they were isolated with their own conscience in their own cell with a Bible and a bit of work to do, that they would repent and see their inner light and go on to leave crime behind. That system broke down fairly quickly. We have records that show that inmates were doubled up in cells and that they weren't actually living in solitary confinement all the time. As early as the mid-1800s, inmates were starting to be doubled up. By 1913, the system of solitary confinement proved essentially outdated. So the inmates transferred to a congregate system so they could congregate for worship and work and recreation. They could have a few more privileges. They could have an expense account to purchase different things like rugs or radios. And depending on the warden, it really depends on the administration to determine what your privileges are. So in the 19-teens and the early 1920s, there was a pretty liberal warden named Robert McKenty, and he allowed a lot of privileges, a lot of sports teams and baseball teams and different clubs to arise. His philosophy was inmates could govern themselves, essentially. And that turned against him in some ways. There were a couple inmate gangs that formed at Eastern State during that era. So the warden after him came in and clamped down, and it was a more security-focused administration. So it kind of depended on the warden what kind of privileges you could get as an inmate. But inmates could have access to just more open communication with each other and more work as the 20th century progressed.
It is a fascinating story what they do at Eastern State Penitentiary. And every season it seems like you push the envelope by offering more and more reasons for people to come out and visit Eastern State. And we should mention that we're putting the website up on the screen where you can find out much more information about Eastern State in terms of the exact locations, driving directions, mass transit, how to get there, admission prices and all that. You could go to the website and find that all out. But how do you, sometimes people may just, their first taste of Eastern State might be at Halloween. So you offer these other programs throughout the year then in the hopes that people will come back and pay a visit, and whether it's touring, Al Capone's cell or taking the audio tour or whatever. How do you where do you come up with the ideas? How do you come up with the ideas and still maintain, I guess, the integrity of Eastern State?
Well, there's so much of Eastern State's history that has yet to be explored. And I think part of that has to do with the period of abandonment from 1970 until when it opened as a historic site in the early 1990s. So there are so many inmate stories and periods of exploration that we as a programming staff want to pursue. So an exciting new project for 2015 is an exhibit that we're calling Beyond Capone: Prison Gangs Then and Now. So we're going to be looking at the history of organized crime figures at Eastern State and also what organized crime looks like in prisons today. And we haven't really talked about organized crime at Eastern State beyond Al Capone, hence the exhibit's title, Beyond Capone. So a lot of our ideas just come out of programming retreats and talking with our visitors and what our tour guides are hearing on tours and things like that. So we always come back to our mission. Is our exhibits mission related? And our mission is to explore the history of Eastern State, to interpret that to the public, and to talk about what's going on in prisons today, to be a venue where these issues can be discussed about crime and punishment and things like that.
It would seem to me that although the prison was abandoned for about 20 years before it opened as a historic site, I mean, do you have much in terms of archives? And I would suspect that someone in your line of work would one day be opening a box that maybe no one has looked at in 20 years, and all of a sudden there's a piece of paper, there's a map, there's an artifact there that provides you that aha moment that you say, we can explore this as a possible venture or tour somewhere down the line. Does that happen?
Yes, it definitely happens. And one of the great parts of our programming is every spring we do a pop-up museum where we get to bring out our artifacts to our visitors, because normally we cannot display them in the historic site because it's a stabilized ruin. So the ruinous conditions, there's no climate control, there's no light control. So this pop-up museum is a really exciting way where we can show our visitors, here are our artifacts and here's what we think, where they come from. We have inmate-made shanks, which are weapons. We have artifacts like handcrafts and photographs and inmate-made ships and paintings. So each of those objects tells a really interesting story, and we're really thrilled that we can share those artifacts with our visitors. Every spring we do a pop-up museum. But yeah, there are a lot of artifacts around the state, around the region. I've spent several different research trips to the Pennsylvania State Archives and the Philadelphia City Archives, and there are so many more stories to tell. I keep coming back to that, but it's just such a rich place. We know that there were about 80,000 inmates at Eastern State in its history, and we really only have about 18,000 of them documented and cataloged in our inmate database. So that's 60,000 more individual stories that we can still tell and explore.
It's fascinating. What happened to all the records? Not to throw a curveball at you here, because you probably may or may not know, but so that ceases as a correctional institution in 1970, opens 20 years later as a historic site. What happens to all of that paperwork as a correctional facility? Does it just get stored away? Does it get shipped to Harrisburg? Does it get burnt? I mean, what happens to it?
Yeah, all of the above.
Really?
The Eastern State Penitentiary was a state institution, so a lot of the state papers went to the state archives in Harrisburg. So my colleagues and I have spent several research trips going there and photographing and scanning everything they have. They have a lot of documentation and mugshots, photographs of different kinds there. I think a lot of things were destroyed, burned, or gotten rid of, trashed. And a lot of things are still coming to our attention. We just got a huge donation, over 1,000 mugshots to the historic site that we thought had been lost forever. Wow. But someone was cleaning out a storage shed and saw some inmate mugshots, and they thought about Eastern State as a potential owner originally of these mugshots, so they donated them back to us. So we're still getting artifacts donated to us, and we're buying artifacts through a variety of outlets. So there's still a lot of, information and photographs and things that are coming back to us that we're discovering.
Yeah, I know another exhibit that's going to open in June is Nutriloaf from around the United States. One doesn't go to the supermarket and find Nutriloaf on the shelf. So what is this Nutriloaf all about?
Right. So the program that we're doing is called Prison Food Weekend, and this has become an annual program that we do in the summertime, and we talk about prison food then and now. So what did Eastern State inmates eat in the 1800s and the 1900s? What do prison inmates eat today? And Nutriloaf is a really interesting food product that's essentially a punishment food product. So prisons today use it for inmates who are disruptive or who misbehave or who are violent, and they are fed this block of food that is pretty unappetizing and almost inedible. It's a mix of some kind of grain and possibly like a meat and ketchup, and there's one recipe that Illinois I think uses applesauce and chili powder, and then it's baked as a loaf and fed to the inmate 3 times a day for up to 7 days. And a lot of inmates have sued over the use of this food product in prisons today as being cruel and unusual behavior, a cruel and unusual punishment. But states have generally upheld prisons' right to feed this Nutriloaf product to inmates. So we are going to be sampling Nutriloaf from across the country at Prison Food Weekend.
So does one find the recipe then in the kitchen of the penitentiary, and that's how you make Nutriloaf? I mean, how do you come up with the recipe for that?
So it's mostly through a Google search and looking through different Department of Corrections. They have a lot of Department of Corrections will have a food or a punishment policy. So I found a number of recipes just going through these Department of Corrections materials.
Another thing, there are artist installations that are also taking place at the facility, at the prison. So what's that all about?
So we have an art program at Eastern State Penitentiary, and it's a very exciting program. We invite artists to propose a piece of art that has to do with the prison's architecture or an issue of crime and justice. And we're excited to say we have 5 new artist installations for this season, and we have 7 returning artist installations from previous seasons. And one of them that we're really excited about, we're working with the City of Philadelphia's Mural Arts program with an artist named Eric Oakday. And he has created 3 portraits through a program called Beyond the Wall. And he worked with inmates at the State Correctional Institute at Graterford, which was actually the prison that was built to replace Eastern State back in it was built in the late 1920s. When Eastern State closed as a state prison in 1970, a lot of the inmates from Eastern State went to Graterford. So Eric Oakday has worked with a number of inmates at Graterford to create a series of portraits showcasing individuals that are affected by imprisonment and mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is essentially, in a nutshell, it's the fact that the American prison population has exploded from 1970 to today. And it affects communities. There are a lot of people tied up in the system. There are victims and re-entering citizens and communities. So Eric Oakday has created these 3 portraits that will be installed on the prison's baseball diamond to represent the faces of mass incarceration.
When someone on your staff, someone at the prison comes up with an idea for an exhibit, give us an idea how long it takes to get off the drawing board and fully incorporated into the prison.
Sure. So we are installing a new exhibit for the season called Beyond Capone. So we wanted to talk about all the organized crime figures beyond Al Capone who were incarcerated at Eastern State. So we have been tossing this idea around at different programming retreats for the past several years. So I've been doing research on this topic, and my colleagues have been doing research, and eventually this has been like a 2 to 3 to 4 year project of conceptualizing this as a thing that we know that our visitors would be interested in, because visitors are very interested in Al Capone's cell. So we thought we could really kind of take our visitors beyond Capone into this whole other story that we've never really talked about, which is the history of prohibition and bootlegging and all of these different organized crime activities that landed individuals at the prison. So we started researching kind of really diligently about a year ago, and then started to develop the signage and the graphics and the text, and we are going to install it for this season. So it's a multi-year process, and sometimes it changes, and sometimes we abandon certain ideas, and sometimes things kind of come up in the news or out of the blue that we think we have to do programming around this. So it kind of depends.
Sure.
Yeah.
And how important is visitors' feedback? Because whether they're coming out for Terror Behind the Walls, or they're coming out for the Al Capone Beyond Capone exhibition, I suspect that you want to gauge the reaction, and if it's working, might that be extended, or if it needs to be tweaked. So give me an idea how you and your staff and everybody there at Eastern State really pay attention to visitors' feedback.
Sure. We do exit surveys. Our marketing department oversees them. So we do tablet surveys and paper surveys, and we ask visitors about their experience at the site, what they enjoyed, what feelings came up for them around a particular exhibit. And we also do, on our audio tour, we do statistics of each audio stop. So we know what visitors are listening to the most, what they're attracted to, and what they're gravitating towards, or what they're not so interested in. So we can tell by those numbers, what signage might need a new audio update or something like to that effect. So we take our visitors' feedback very seriously. They are the most important people that come to the site. They're our bread and butter, and we love our visitors. And it's really important to connect with them and to listen to them. So we have a variety of mechanisms for getting their feedback. We also have a feedback wall at the front of the prison. So visitors will often encounter it on their way out of the prison, and we'll ask a question about a piece of programming that we're doing, like, what did you think of Prison Food Weekend? And did you taste the Nutriloaf? Tell us what you think. And we try to engage our visitors we try to get beyond yes, no questions and try to ask them, what do they think about this particular issue, or to give us feedback. So we have multiple feedback platforms, and we hope that we are taking our visitors' questions or concerns very seriously, and our visitorship numbers keep growing, so we think we're doing some things right.
That's important. That's absolutely important. In the minute that we have left here, I know quickly I want to, I think there's also a pet weekend, or there's a pet experience that's also coming up.
That's right. We do a family weekend every summer called Pets in Prison, where we partner with an organization called New Leash on Life, and it's a prison dog training program. So it has inmates training dogs that have been abandoned. So it's good for both the inmates and the dogs. And then we bring the dogs on site, and families can interact with the dogs and hear about New Leash on Life, and even have the potential to adopt a dog.
Oh, that's fascinating work. And you do a great job, everybody there at Eastern State, in making it the top tourist destination here in the region, not just for the city of Philadelphia, but for the region. If you want more information about all the offerings at Eastern State, you could go to easternstate.org. And you can find out more information about hours of operation, exact location, ticket admission prices, and all of the exhibitions that they have going on. Annie, I want to thank you for your time here on the program. Great job, and look forward to catching up with you again real soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Until the next time, my name is Paul Pirillo. Thanks so much for listening and watching The Philly Factor.